Okay, in the next lecture, this will be a shorter one um, than the last one. We're going to talk about the next type of hypersensitivity reaction, type 2 hypersensitivity. Now, this is largely based on the reaction of the immune system with factors or proteins that are on the surface of blood cells. So antibodies that react with antigens on the surface of blood cells. These are called blood groups, and they're typically sugars or glycolipids or protein glycoproteins. And you're familiar with these because these are the blood groups. Um, the blood groups are AB, and O, and there's also RH factor, which is the Reese's blood group. Um, The key thing about blood groups is that if you're born, for example, with A, then you have IgM, you actually produce antibodies that are anti-B. If you're B, you produce antibodies that are anti-A. If you're AB, you produce none of those antibodies because, of course, they'd react. If you're O, you produce antibodies for anti-A and anti-B. Blood cells that are deemed to be foreign are removed by ADCC, so antibodies that bind to, for example, anti-B that would bind to B would be attacked by phagocytic cells like macrophages. Um, and this is one reason for blood transfusion reactions um, when blood that's incompatible is given to a patient and there's a reaction. The other factors are RH factors or Reese's blood groups, and about 85% are Rh positive and about 15% are Rh negative. And this can result in Rh incompatibility, and as we'll see, this is potentially treatable, and this is a potential type of hypersensitivity reaction. Now, blood groups themselves were discovered by Carl Landsteiner in the early part of about the 1920s, and around about the 1920s. He is one of the fathers, really, of immunology, particularly his exhaustive studies of what makes an antigen, and what are particular molecular structures that are important in eliciting an antibody or that can bind to an antibody. And he was a discoverer of the ABO blood groups and the RH blood groups. One of the reasons for this was, and he won the Nobel Prize for this in 1930. One of the reasons for this was this was so important is because surgery up at that time, particularly if you came into a surgery and you needed to have surgery in the 1900 or early 19th century, late 1800s, early 1900s, you would of course potentially need blood into a transfusion, and so typically what would happen is you might have someone who maybe a friend, maybe the nurse there, maybe a member of your family would be hooked up next to you during the surgery, and your blood would be literally your blood would flow from you into the patient who was undergoing the surgery, which would be next to you. There was no refrigeration at that time, and so being able to refrigerate blood or store blood was not possible. What the problem was is that surgery could be quite you could quite successful in terms of the actual mechanics of it, but it was recognized that you ran a real risk that certain people, when they had the blood transfusions, they would have the surgery, but they would have terrible reactions and potentially die from the blood transfusion reaction. And it was Landsteiner that discovered what that was due to, the molecular structures that we're doing on blood, and that essentially was one of the pieces that made surgery possible. The other piece was Oswald Robertson, who in World War I figured out how to store blood using citrate glucose solutions, and the first use of refrigeration. And so this was really important, and one of the instigations, you know, inspirations for this was the fact in World War One you had massive amounts of soldiers who were getting undergoing who were wounded, who needed blood transfusion, and it was realized they needed blood transfusions, um, and you needed to store that blood. And in his case, he stored O blood because that's blood that can be given to any recipient. And so those are two: the blood groups and being able to figure out how to store blood and store it for long periods of time so that you could donate it for surgical use, were two huge things in the early part of the 1900s, early part of the 20th century. Now, of course, the benefits of this were increase in ability to um, to really innovate in surgical techniques, which is one of the, unfortunately, it is one of the sort of payoffs that you get um, from wars. That certainly was true in the Civil War, and it's certainly true in World War One and in World War Two, because you have a lot of trauma, and then the techniques and all have gotten better with each one of those, and you can see, giving blood here was posters about giving blood, how important that was, to to the armed forces to be able to have that blood and be able to store it for the soldiers. Um, Now, the blood groups themselves are, as I said again, are oligosaccharide lipids, and you can see here these are just the structures. Of course, these aren't structures. These are just as a cartoon with the structures. And there's two key sugars that are really important that define this, and one of those is N-acetylgalactosamine, or what's referred to as GalNAc. And you have this core oligosaccharide which has fructose, galactose, GalNAc, galactose, and glucose, and appended to that in a branch is GalNAc, fructose, galactose, and this forms the A antigen. For the B antigen, it's a replacement of GalNAc with galactose. And the O antigen does not have either one of these sugars, so that's missing. So those are the two. So the definition of this antigen is, for B has galactose, for A GalNAc, and for O it's missing. So for a person who has A blood will have will have antibodies to this antigen, the B, and a person who has B blood will have antibodies to this antigen, which has the GalNAc, for A. And people who are O blood can will have will have antibodies to both of them. So if we look at this little chart, this is just sort of a handy little chart. We're going to expand on this in a minute, but for blood group compatibility, if a person is O, they do not have the antigen on their surface, either one of those sugars, then they can be, that blood can be given to O, A, B, or the other form is AB, in which a person can express both antigens, and in that case they don't express antibodies to either A or B. And so since the O blood doesn't have the antigens on it, it can be given to any of these, because none of the antibodies that are present in any of these recipients won't be able to react with that O blood. This is different for A blood, because if you give A blood to an O recipient, because it has both the antibodies, it's going to react with it. If you give it to a person who has B, who is a B recipient, it's going to react, and their antibodies are going to react with the donor's blood. A, of course, won't react with itself, and AB, which doesn't have any antibodies, won't. The same is true for B blood, except it's just switched. Except it's just switched. Now you won't have any reaction with B blood, but B blood will now react with the B antibodies and the A recipient. If a person is AB, in other words, they express both antigens, both sets of antigens, then they can't be given to anyone who's O, A, or B because they express the antibodies that would interact with both either one of these or both of these antigens. They are given to uh, they are given to it can only be given to a recipient who is AB. What this means is that O is referred to as the universal donor. AB, which doesn't have antibodies to either one, is the universal recipient. So they can potentially get blood from anyone. Now, of course, the parents, you inherit alleles from both your mother and your father, and so you can have combinations in which if one parent's A, another parent's A, you would have A. The blood type would be A. One parent's A, one parent's B. You have AB blood or AB. One parent's A, one parent's O. You have AO blood, so your blood type is A. One parent's B, one parent's A. One parent's A, you would have AB blood again, and so you would be AB. So there's a second AB. Both parents are B, you're B blood. Just B, if you're one parent's B, one parent's O blood, you're still B. And if both parents are O, then you are O. And so you can see here the probability, if the population was all equal, would be that there would be there would be proportionally similar amount of people who had A, B, and AB blood, and the lowest would be O blood. For RH factors, this is another antigen on the surface of blood. It's a very similar in which you have RH positive, mother or father, you're RH positive, RH negative on the mother, RH positive, you're RH positive, RH positive, RH negative father, RH positive, and again, you're only RH negative if both parents are RH negative. So again, if everything was equal, most of the it would be more people would be RH positive than RH negative. When if we look now, if we combine those in which we have A, B, O, and RH positive, RH negative, that's how we get O negative, O positive, A negative blood. Then essentially this is just sort of expands this, and so O negative doesn't have any of the antigens, again, is the universal donor. It can be donated to any of these blood groups. It doesn't have any of the antigens, and so none of these could potentially react. AB positive, again, the universal recipient. It can take any of these because it doesn't have antibodies to either the A, B, or RH factor. And what I mean by this is that if you were to get, and we'll come to this, if you were to given, for example, O positive blood was given to an O negative person, then that blood could be recognized by the immune system because this antigen is not there, the RH antigen is not there, and so you could actually generate an immune reaction to that, generate antibodies to that O positive blood. In the U.S., so just again, for AB positive for donors, they can only be given to AB positive recipients. And you can see here, this just expands. This is just expanded. It's that graph, that blast table, so that, for example, if you have B negative or if you have A positive, you can only be given to A positive and to AB positive recipients. whereas A negative can be given to A negative and AB negative. So it's very it's very similar. In the U.S., O positive and O positive and A positive account for about 72% of the blood groups, followed by less, as it turns out, followed by B positive, 9%, and the rarest is um, AB negative. And so the population itself has a history. There's a tremendous history in the U.S. And also marriage across all kinds of ethnic with all kinds of ethnic diversity, and so it's not a 50, it's not a third, it's not a 25, 25, 25, 25. It is whatever it is. It is what has arisen historically. Um, and that's going to be true in a lot of different countries. You'll see there'll be different proportions of these blood groups, the prevalence of these blood groups in the population. Now, the type 2 hypersensitivity reaction that we're going to talk about has to do with a particular case in which you have a mother, and I know this is kind of a very it's not a great drawing. It's a very simple drawing in which the mother is this circle, and you have a fetus, and the mother is Rh negative. The father was Rh positive, and what's happened is that the fetus is now Rh positive. Now there's a placenta, and then the mother, and this is initially protected. There's initial protection because you don't have antibodies to the mother doesn't have antibodies to a Rh factor because she's never been exposed to that. And so this initially is fine, but during delivery, delivery is quite a messy, it's a messy thing. During delivery, with the tearing of the placenta, during delivery you can get blood mixing, and mixing of the blood between the mother and the fetus. And what it means is that some of the infants, right here, infants' red blood cells will be mixed or come into contact with the blood with the blood from the mother. Now that can initiate then in which the mother's B cells can recognize that Rh factor and of course generate an immune response to that, which will generate antibodies to the Rh factor. And these of course present memory cells, plasmacytes, and IgM and IgG. Now on a second pregnancy, this is where the problem comes in, is that a second pregnancy in which the infant is Rh positive too, also, that the mother has generated anti-Rh antibodies from this first pregnancy, and so this would be like the booster. It's getting a boost, and in this case, because the placenta is permeable to these antibodies, the mother's own antibodies, anti-Rh monomers, will then go after the infant's red blood cells, and this can lead to ADCC, destruction of the fetus's red blood cells, and this is what's referred to as is distress. The infant is in distress because the red blood cells are being destroyed. Now, a way to combat that has been to develop a passive immunization therapy in which you develop antibodies to Rh, and those are given to the mother either directly before birth, or certainly right after birth, in things called Rogaine, and these are antibodies to Rh. And so if you give those antibodies to Rh to the mother, they will essentially bind to the Rh and eliminate and block antibodies and block the Rh from interacting with B cells from the mother, and therefore block the ability to generate antibodies from the exposure to the Rh factor. So the infant's So what you're trying to do here is block with the RhoGAM the antibodies, give the mother antibodies that will block its ability to bind to the antibodies on the surface of the mother's B cells. Um, it doesn't mean it will still go through the ADCC. It can still be destroyed by macrophages and phagocytic cells, but it can't interact with the B cells, and so therefore you can't get antibody produced, as you now know through the AMI response. And so this is referred to as RhoGAM, or it's Rho-D immunoglobulin, and this is to the surface antigen. So if it's basically produced from the immunization using Rh H positive cells to inject those into men or women who are you don't want to do under pregnant women or potential women who are fertile, but and of course men cells, and they're given injections of this, and then the potential donors have produce antibodies to the Rh factor, and then the antibodies are harvested from the plasma. They're collected. Essentially, a person gets a couple boosters, and then later on, their plasma is collected from the donors, and that provides passive transient protection against the development of the antibodies, and so that the mother, does not become sensitized to it. Of course, under these cases, the mother must be Rh negative, of course, and the mother should not have had a previously sensitized to Rh factor. It won't work if the mother's already been sensitized, and the infant, and therefore the father, must be Rh positive. If the father's Rh negative and the mother's Rh positive, it doesn't matter. If the mother's Rh negative, the father's Rh negative, it doesn't matter. They don't need to be given. So it's only when the father is Rh positive and the mother's Rh negative. And so this has been shown to be effective given 72 hours 72 hours after postpartum, with only about a 10 to 20, 10 to 12%, 10 to 13% rate of sensitization. So it's essentially 88 to 89% effective. So here's a couple of review questions. We're going to stop here. You can take this review. You can stop the video here, do the reviews, check and see what you've learned. And the next slide will be the answers to that. So this will end the type 2 hypersensitivity reaction. In the next installment, we'll be doing type 3 and type 4.